Now here's a really unlikely scenario. A wet race in Bahrain. As pretty as it looks in F124, this is pretty unlikely to happen. But if I'm going to do my wet car setup series properly, that's going to include every track, even Bahrain. Before I get to our wet Bahrain setup, I just wanted to mention that all of the wet car setups in this series are designed for longer distance races. I used a racing wheel to create them, and I have all assist disabled. You are going to need to hustle your car around some tracks, as you'll see in the gameplay, and that's because these setups are designed to be fast as well as relatively stable. If any setups do feel too slippery or tricky to control, I'd recommend watching my F124 wet setup guide video for some tips on improving your feel in wet conditions. Generally, adding more wing angle or lowering your on-throttle diff can go a long way to adding more stability at the expense of some outright performance. With that said, let's kick off the Aerodynamics setup, and I've gone with 38 and 29. This is a slight boost from our dry setup. I've gone +2 on the front wing and +3 on the rear wing. This aero setup is designed for wet conditions where you're running intermediate tyres. If you're facing heavy rain and running full wet tyres, I'd increase the front and rear wing aero by another 2 clicks. With the transmission setup, as I mentioned earlier, reducing your on-throttle diff is a must when heading into a wet race. I've gone with 25 on the on-throttle, and I've actually lowered the off-throttle by 5 as well, down to 50. I've left the engine braking at 70%. The suspension geometry is pretty similar to our dry setup. Camber is all the way to the left as always. The front toe I've reduced down to 0 to remove some drag, and I've actually decreased the rear toe a little bit again to improve our drag and our top speed now that we're adding a bit more aero. Plus, at the slower speeds that you'll be travelling at in a wet race, you don't quite need as much rear toe to help with stability. With the suspension, I've kept the front and rear suspension the same for Bahrain. I've gone 37 and 4. And then I've lowered the front ARB down to 12 and I've lowered the rear ARB down to 7. This just promotes a little bit more stability and a car that's slightly easier to control in the wet. We don't need a car that's quite as aggressive and stiff. For the ride height, I've bumped the front ride height up to 27 just to help with some clearance over puddles and those slipperier curbs. I've left the rear ride height alone at 58. For the brakes, the one thing I have changed from our dry setup is actually reducing the brake pressure down to 98%. You'll see in some of the tracks that we visit in our wet series, I will leave the brake pressure at 100%, some are low to 99, some to 98, depending on kind of how hard it is and how tricky it is to brake at that track. At Bahrain, some of the braking zones are a bit tricky, especially turn 10, so lower the pressure down to 98%, but keep your brake bias at 55. Then the tyre pressures we're running are very similar to our dry setup. All of them are actually the same, apart from the front right tyre, which I've bumped up to 25. So I've gone 25 on both fronts and 26.5 on both rears. And that'll round out our first wet car setup for F124. This is the first in a long series, and as I mentioned at the beginning, it's quite an unlikely scenario to get rain in Bahrain. But if you fancy something different and load up a Grand Prix with a wet race, this is the setup to use. I will be running through every single circuit in F124 and create a wet setup for it, so hit that subscribe button and help us get to 100,000 subscribers, and hitting that alert bell will also allow you to be notified when I drop a new wet setup. But for now guys, enjoy this and I will see you on track.